At exactly 1:47 in the morning, a silent corridor opened above the Sahel. For 6 minutes, no satellite, radar, or surveillance feed saw a thing. A small part of the African sky simply disappeared from the global grid. When the signal returned, something had already moved, and nothing would ever be the same again. Far below that blank space, in the darkness of northern Burkina Faso, a convoy of trucks rolled across the desert. There were no insignias, no radio calls, no foreign advisors standing by. Only engines moving forward, steady and sure. Inside one of those vehicles sat Captain Ibrahim Traore, a man who had learned the cost of waiting. For years, he had watched his country call for help while villages burned and promises from foreign capitals faded into dust. That night, there would be no more waiting. In a world where permission had become a habit, the people of Burkina Faso were learning something new: how to act without it. In 2023, the nation had launched the Patriotic Support Fund, raising its own resources to defend its own soil. It was more than money. It was a declaration that sovereignty wasn't a favor, but a right. The sound of those engines was more than the hum of machines. It was the heartbeat of a continent that had waited too long for others to decide its fate. If a nation must choose between waiting for approval and protecting its children, which would you expect it to do? Hold that thought. Because the story of Ibrahim Traore is not just about weapons or politics. It is about a people reclaiming their dignity in the quiet hours before dawn, when freedom began to move on its own wheels. Do you feel it? That pulse of determination that refuses to fade. Stay with us as we follow the road where silence met courage and permission finally lost its power. Under the dim light of dawn, the engines of 23 trucks carried more than steel. They carried a message that words alone could never express. When France formally ended Operation Barkhane in November 2022, foreign bases once filled with flags and advisors were left silent. Empty barracks stood as monuments to promises that had expired. In villages across the Sahel, people waited for peace that never came. By 2023, the waiting had turned into a quiet decision. Burkina Faso would no longer borrow its own security. Captain Ibrahim Traore had seen too much loss to keep asking for permission. He understood that dependence had become a kind of chain, polished by diplomacy, but still heavy on the people's shoulders. His answer was not rebellion. It was order, discipline, and self-reliance. In January 2023, he launched the Patriotic Support Fund, inviting citizens to finance their own defense. Within a year, nearly 100 billion CFA francs had been raised from gold exports, small contributions, and national pride. It was the beginning of a new arithmetic: protection through participation. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, local technicians began restoring abandoned vehicles. Soldiers trained not under foreign instructors, but under veterans who knew the terrain by heart. The convoy that crossed the desert that night symbolized a shift more profound than any speech. It was not about weapons, but about will. China's Norinco provided equipment once considered too advanced for Africa. Yet Traore framed the partnership not as loyalty to Beijing, but as logic. They delivered tools, not lectures. Across the Sahel, that logic began to echo. Markets reopened where roads had been secured. Families returned to farmlands that had been empty for years. What outsiders saw as militarization, locals called survival. For the first time in decades, protection came from within. There were no blue helmets, no foreign uniforms, no waiting for reports to be approved. Still, the decision carried risk. Western analysts described the move as unthinkable, even dangerous. They warned of new dependencies and regional instability. Yet in Burkina Faso's towns, the people called it inevitable. When protection becomes conditional, independence itself becomes a form of rebellion. That night, the rebellion was silent, but it was real. At 2 a.m, the convoy moved along the road toward Kaya. Inside the lead truck, Traore rested his hand on the radio panel. He did not speak. The silence was deliberate, a reminder that sometimes power speaks loudest when it does not ask for attention. Behind him, dust rose like smoke, covering the tracks as if the earth itself had decided to protect the secret. The world would later call it a mystery, a blackout, a shadow movement through the Sahel. But for the people who lived there, it was simple. It was a statement written in motion. It said, "We will defend ourselves, not because someone allowed it, but because no one else will." And as the convoy disappeared into the night, a question began to rise with the stars. Could one act of defiance, built on discipline and necessity, truly change the destiny of a continent? If you have ever watched a nation reclaim what it had been told to surrender, you know that history often begins in moments like this. Quiet, unrecorded, yet unstoppable. Stay with us, because what began with a convoy in the desert would soon test the patience of the world. The engines came to a stop just before dawn. A pale line of light began to draw itself across the desert horizon as 23 vehicles stood in formation outside a reinforced hangar north of Ouagadougou. The air was still, thick with dust and exhaustion. Soldiers stepped out one by one, their faces shadowed, their eyes fixed on the man who had led them there. Captain Ibrahim Traore stood silent for a long moment before he spoke. His voice was low, steady, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for prayer. "We do not own weapons," he said. "We own the right to defend ourselves." Those words spread faster than any broadcast. Within hours, they were repeated in markets, in homes, in army posts, whispered as both relief and warning. For some, it felt like the end of humiliation. For others, it marked the beginning of something unknown. Across the Sahel, the sound of a single convoy had become an echo of awakening. In the capital, the National Security Council met in an emergency session. 12 men and women, most of them veterans of a generation that had grown up under foreign protection, sat around a faded map of the Sahel. The map's lines were drawn decades earlier by hands that had never touched its soil. Traore pointed to it. "How long do we wait for others to protect what is ours?" he asked. No one answered. They all knew the answer had already arrived with the engines. That afternoon, he signed the decree to formalize the Patriotic Support Fund, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a necessity of survival. The doctrine that followed would later be called the doctrine of necessity. It was not built on ideology. It was built on mathematics. Waiting had become more dangerous than acting, and dependency had become more costly than independence. The logic was brutally simple. No one defends what they do not own. The reaction outside Burkina Faso was immediate. In Washington, briefings described the development as an anomaly, a strategic irregularity. In Paris, commentators spoke of a dangerous illusion of sovereignty. European headlines framed the move as evidence of Chinese expansion in Africa, while Beijing's official press maintained silence. In the Sahel, That silence was taken as a sign of respect. For the people, this was not geopolitics. It was redemption. In villages once abandoned by foreign missions, families began hearing radio broadcasts in their own language, announcing locally trained patrols. A farmer in Kaya told a visiting journalist, "This time, the soldiers who protect us also eat our food. That is how I know they will stay." His words captured what years of treaties had failed to deliver: trust born of proximity. Western analysts called it unthinkable that a small African nation could organize a multi-million-dollar defense procurement without oversight from international banks. But in Burkina Faso, unthinkable had become ordinary. Traore's initiative was not about defiance. It was about survival through dignity. He often repeated one phrase to his officers: "Permission is the language of the powerless." The convoy had done more than transport weapons. It had carried a signal that dependency was a choice. Across the Sahel, younger officers began quoting Traore's words, sharing them in training camps and on encrypted channels. The message was not "fight the world," it was "stand without apology." Yet every rise invites scrutiny. As international observers began to track the development, questions grew. Would this new independence invite isolation? Would the West cut aid or impose sanctions? Could new partnerships avoid turning into new dependencies? One French columnist warned that discipline can harden into defiance. Another, more sympathetic, wrote, "Perhaps we are witnessing not rebellion, but recovery." Back in Ouagadougou, Traore listened to the reports without reaction. He knew perception would shift, that one misstep could undo months of progress. His advisors urged him to soften his tone, to reassure the West. Instead, he chose restraint. He said only, "Let our actions speak." That night, as he returned to the hangar, the same truck stood lined in silence. The soldiers who had driven them looked up as he passed. They did not salute. They simply nodded, a quiet gesture of understanding. Each man and woman there knew the truth. What began in darkness was no longer a secret. It was a statement. But could that statement endure the weight of global politics? Could one nation's will become a region's shield? If history has taught anything, it is that the moment you claim the right to stand alone, the world starts testing how far you can walk. The test for Burkina Faso had only just begun. Stay with us, because the next turn on this road will reveal not just the cost of sovereignty, but its true meaning. By the time the convoy's dust had settled, the change was already visible. In the outskirts of Kaya, children returned to schools that had been closed for months. Markets reopened under the protection of local units funded by citizens themselves. Villagers once too afraid to travel beyond their fences now walked to the wells at dawn, carrying water jugs instead of fear. Across Burkina Faso, people began to believe in something they had not felt in years: safety that came from within. The Patriotic Support Fund had become more than a budget. It was a bond between the state and its citizens. Gold miners, farmers, and small shopkeepers contributed what they could, sometimes only a few coins, yet each coin carried meaning. When the first equipment bought through the fund arrived, soldiers gathered to watch. No one cheered. They stood quietly, understanding that this was not charity. It was ownership. Politically, the doctrine of necessity began reshaping regional identity. In September 2023, Burkina Faso joined Mali and Niger to sign the Liptako Gourma Charter, forming the Alliance of Sahel States. It was not a grand declaration delivered in front of cameras. It was a practical pact, forged from exhaustion and need. Each nation agreed to share intelligence, coordinate border defenses, and train together without relying on foreign oversight. The message was clear. If no one else would guarantee their survival, they would guarantee it themselves. In Bamako, soldiers trained side by side with Burkinabe units, speaking different dialects, but sharing the same language of survival. In Niamey, engineers learned to maintain communication systems that once depended on European contractors. The alliance operated on three principles: discipline, transparency, and shared restraint. Traore called it strength guided by conscience. The new structure began to show results. Attacks on supply routes declined. Community patrols increased coordination. Even markets once known for tension between ethnic groups reported a rare calm. International observers from neutral countries, including Switzerland and Kenya, visited the field to review protocols and found something unexpected. It was not aggression they saw, but discipline in motion. Still, every success carried a shadow. The alliance's financial burden was heavy. Maintaining logistics and training required resources the region could barely afford. Officials estimated the collective cost near $1 billion per year. Foreign donors watched from a distance, uncertain whether to help or to wait for failure. Critics warned that self-reliance could become isolation. Others feared that new partnerships with China could create a new form of dependency, only with different conditions. Traore understood the tension. In meetings with his cabinet, he repeated a single reminder: power without discipline becomes violence, but fear of power becomes slavery. His challenge was to keep both dangers at bay. For that reason, he insisted that every operation be recorded, reviewed, and publicly acknowledged. Mistakes would not be hidden. Transparency, he said, was the second front in the war for legitimacy. Outside government buildings, life moved with quiet determination. In Wahiguya, a young teacher rebuilt a small classroom using leftover materials from an abandoned foreign project. When asked why, she answered, "Because waiting has never brought us help." Her story spread through local radio, becoming a symbol of the same philosophy guiding the state. Protection and progress were now the same mission. Across cafes in Washington and Paris, analysts debated what this meant. Was it the rise of a new bloc or the start of another fragile experiment? The old vocabulary of dependency no longer fit. Words like aid and partnership felt outdated against a movement defined by self-funding and shared defense. For the people on the ground, those debates felt distant. They saw roads repaired, hospitals supplied, and soldiers who looked like their sons standing guard at night. There were no slogans about liberation, only quiet work done in daylight. Sovereignty had become a daily routine, not a ceremony. Yet the alliance's very success made others uneasy. Intelligence reports suggested that Western powers were reassessing their presence in the region, wary that independence could shift alliances permanently. The Sahel, once seen as a peripheral zone, was now a mirror reflecting global change. Could three nations, bound by necessity rather than wealth, sustain such a transformation? Could discipline alone hold when the costs rose higher and the patience of the world grew thin? For every kilometer of secured road, there was another still waiting to be reclaimed. For every border defended, another remained uncertain. But to those who lived through the years of silence, uncertainty was better than abandonment. Stay with us. Because what comes next is not just about borders or weapons. It is about how the world responds when a continent decides to protect itself, even when no one believes it can. In Washington, the story of Burkina Faso's awakening reached the corridors of the State Department like a signal no one was ready to interpret. At first, analysts framed it as a footnote, another local initiative bound to fade. But as reports from the Alliance of Sahel states accumulated, the tone began to shift. What had started as a regional experiment was now altering long-standing assumptions about who controls stability in Africa. Inside think tanks across the city, policy experts debated whether the Sahel's defiance was rebellion or reflection. Some saw echoes of America's own founding spirit, the right to self-defense, the rejection of distant authority. A retired diplomat, once stationed in Mali, put it simply during an interview. "They remind me of us long ago, when we learned that asking for freedom is not the same as having it." His words unsettled the room. It was easier to view Africa as dependent than to recognize its independence as familiar. At the Pentagon, the reaction was mixed. Military planners called the Alliance of Sahel States a potential partner if discipline holds. Others feared it could become an opening for Chinese influence, especially as Norinco's name appeared in procurement lists. Reports from the Rand Corporation suggested that China's competence model, which offered capability without conditions, was reshaping African preferences faster than any ideological campaign. Still, another section of the same report carried a warning. If Washington answers dignity with arrogance, it will lose not influence, but respect. In Paris, editorials were sharper. French newspapers described the new independence as a dangerous illusion of sovereignty. Beneath that phrase hid something deeper, almost personal, resentment that Africa no longer asked for permission. European headlines questioned whether the Sahel's confidence might spread southward, rewriting decades of policy crafted around control and dependence. Beijing, in contrast, remained silent. For many in the Sahel, that silence spoke louder than any speech. It suggested a form of respect that Western capitals had forgotten how to show. The people of Burkina Faso did not call it geopolitics. They called it acknowledgement. For once, their story was being told not as a problem, but as proof of agency. Across American homes, especially among veterans and older citizens, online forums began discussing Traore's speeches. Some saw in them a reflection of old lessons about sacrifice, discipline, and self-determination. "They remind me of who we used to be," one comment read. The parallels were uncomfortable, yet undeniable. The question hanging over every discussion was the same. Could the United States recognize in Africa the same struggle for independence it once demanded for itself? Could it see discipline not as defiance, but as dignity? In that uncertainty lies the next frontier of diplomacy. Because when nations begin to act with the confidence America once admired, the challenge is not how to control them, but how to stand beside them. Stay with us, because what happens next will test whether the world still believes that freedom, wherever it appears, is worth respecting. By the end of 2025, the Sahel had changed its rhythm. What began as a silent convoy through the desert had become a living structure of cooperation. In Ouagadougou, the same hangar that once hid armored vehicles now served as a training center where young engineers learned to repair and design their own equipment. In Bamako and Niamey, classrooms once empty, now filled with students studying radar systems, and communications networks. Sovereignty was no longer a word spoken in speeches. It was something built each morning by people who refused to be forgotten. The Alliance of Sahel States had grown beyond its founders' expectations. Its sovereignty fund reached billions, drawing from gold, agriculture, and uranium revenues. Roads that were once riddled with fear now carried commerce. Hospitals reopened. Patrols moved not as symbols of defiance, but of stability. Yet the success came with weight. Costs rose. Old powers watched with suspicion. Sanctions were whispered. Aid was delayed. Every act of self-reliance seemed to provoke quiet resistance. Ibrahim Traore met these challenges with calm. "If progress offends those who preferred our dependency," he said, "then offense will be the price of dignity." His tone was not anger. It was acceptance. The maturity of a nation that understood freedom demands responsibility. For Burkina Faso, sovereignty was no longer rebellion. It was discipline, practiced every day in the way a soldier held his weapon, the way a teacher opened her classroom, the way a farmer planted again after years of war. But history is rarely kind to those who stand alone. Could the alliance of Sahel states endure the world's silence? Could three nations, built on necessity, survive when necessity fades? These questions remain, heavy as the desert heat, because every movement toward independence also carries the shadow of isolation. Every victory demands vigilance. Still, across the Sahel, there was hope. The hum of engines now meant something different. It was not secrecy. It was service. A rhythm of purpose that connected villages, families, and generations. The same engines that once crossed the desert in silence now carried medicine, food, and children to school. What began as defense had evolved into development. If this story has touched you, do not let it end here. Reflect on what sovereignty means in your own life. When do we stop asking for permission to protect what matters most? When do we decide that dignity must no longer wait? If you believe that justice, family, and faith still have the power to guide nations, then share that belief in whatever way you can. Speak it, write it, live it. Because stories like this one are not just history. They are reminders that conscience is as strong as any weapon, and courage as lasting as any monument. May God bless the hands that build peace, the hearts that protect it, and the people who still believe that freedom is not granted, it is maintained. We will meet again in the next chapter of Africa's story, where the dawn keeps rising and hope refuses to fade.